Hello, my name is Andrew Souza. I'm a student with the Colorado Christian University College of Adult and Graduate Studies, majoring in criminal justice. Today I've been asked to make a video discussing domestic terrorism and lessons learned by local law enforcement in addressing domestic terrorism. So first, what is domestic terrorism? Well, domestic terrorism, as defined by the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, defines domestic terrorism as the unlawful use or threatened use of force or violence by a group of individuals based and operating entirely within the United States or Puerto Rico without foreign direction, committed against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. So that's the legal definition. So what does this mean practically? Well, I'll give you three examples. In all of my examples, I will not be addressing the name of the terrorist as to not give the terrorist credit. Okay, so the first example is going to be perhaps the most infamous event of domestic terrorism in United States history. This example is going to be the 1995 lone wolf terrorist attack of the Oklahoma City building. In this attack, a Ryder truck loaded with fertilizer was detonated outside of the Oklahoma City building. In this event, 168 people were killed, including 19 children, and over 680 people were tragically killed. More recent examples include this week, where a Florida man was mailing suspicious packages that looked like bombs to Democrat leaders and those who disagree with the current president. In all, he mailed 13 packages to Democratic leaders, including the former Vice President Joe Biden. This qualifies as domestic terrorism because it was the threatened use of violence for political objectives. Fortunately, nobody was injured. A more tragic recent example will be the October 27th Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. In this event, a man went into a local synagogue armed with an AR-15 and several handguns, yelling anti-Semitic slurs and shooting Jewish practitioners. This counts as terrorism because it is the use of violence for social objectives. In all, 11 people were killed and several police officers were shot. Now that I've given examples, we will move on into the practical application. My discussion will focus on local schools, businesses, churches, and government buildings, and lessons learned by law enforcement and what they can do better to better address domestic terrorism. The first area of interest that will be discussed is domestic terrorism in local schools. All too often, unfortunately, domestic terrorism in local schools takes form in school shootings. The term school shootings brings up a multitude of emotions, mainly because those killed in school shootings are often young children. In December 2017, I attended a 16-hour training with the Sterling Police Department when I was captain of their Explorer Post. Whereas this training was not specifically directed towards schools, the practical application in our practice was a school. During this training, we spent many hours discussing previous school shootings and what the police did wrong. And then we spent hours talking about current events and what the police did right. The first thing we discussed was Columbine. During that shooting, the police were ill-equipped and untrained on how to handle the school shooting. The police, instead of going in immediately and stopping the school shooter, waited for tactical units to arrive. This decision resulted in much more loss of life. Now, police need to train department-wide to actively go in and stop the shooting. On average, 8 people die per minute of school shooting. 8 people. That's tragic. What police need to do is train department-wide, instead of in tactical units, to go in and quickly and effectively neutralize the threat. To do this, the police need to move fast. They need to move to the direct area of shooting. This is not a normal SWAT call where the police will move room to room methodically and very carefully. Also, they need to stay off the radio so they can receive key pieces of information. Rather than calling on scene once they arrive, they need to only use the radio to discuss critical logistics in response to that event. Hopefully, in doing this, the police will be able to better respond to the school shootings and make sure that the loss of life is minimized in this. The next lesson learned in school shootings is the need for fortified schools. All too often, shooters can enter school freely at their own will. Schools need to better equip themselves and fortify themselves to protect its students and to stop shooters from accessing the precious children inside, and must not allow shooters as easy entrance into the school. The next area we'll be discussing today is in reference to domestic terrorism, is attacks against local businesses. Attacks against local businesses often take form in two distinct ways. The first way is in bombings. This has been seen in the 2017 Manchester bombing in London after an Ariana Grande concert. In this attack, a suicide bomber ran into the arena and killed himself and many others at the end of an Ariana Grande concert. The next form that domestic terrorism may take shape against local businesses is in in mass shootings. So what police can do to mitigate this and assist local businesses in combating terrorism is pushing the "If you see something, say something" campaign. This campaign simply teaches people that if they see something that doesn't look right, to tell law enforcement and to be proactive and not just be a bystander to hopefully stop a terrorist attack. With this, there's also the need for teaching people what to look for. In my agency, the Colorado State Patrol, we do what we call safety talks with local businesses, where we'll come in and we'll discuss how businesses can be more safe and what they can do to help themselves and decrease injuries and fatalities. One thing that local law enforcement can do is implement these safety talks, and during these safety talks discuss terrorism and ways to, and identifying factors in terrorism that can help them identify what they need to report to law enforcement in the "If you see something, say something" campaign. Another good implementation that law enforcement could work with in local businesses is developing a panic button, similar to what they have in banks. If something's going on in a local business that they need to immediately alert the police about and covertly alert the police about, they could simply activate this panic button and the police would be alerted that there's something that they need to respond to that could be terrorist related. The next area to be discussed is churches. Churches often find themselves the target of domestic terrorism because of their religious affiliations. Many times terrorism is motivated by extremist religious affiliations and ideology. Therefore, churches often do find themselves the target of these attacks. When law enforcement works with churches to better equip them to respond to terrorist attacks, they have to be very careful because they don't want to give the image that they are helping or encouraging violence in churches. However, there are a few steps that they can take. They can, again, teach church leaders and church employees the "if you see something, say something" principle and help them to recognize signs of terrorist attacks before they happen and recognize those people that may be casing the church or trying to do reconnaissance on the church for future terrorist attacks. The next thing law enforcement can do to better respond to churches in domestic terrorist events is helping churches to lock their doors from the outside when there are services going on. Of course, you don't ever want to lock people inside of a church, again, because of image issues. You don't want the church to look like it's an extremist organization itself. However, you do want to protect those who are inside of the church from terrorist attacks. You want to make it as hard as possible for someone to be able to attack this church. And again, law enforcement can do a safety talk or safety meeting with church leaders to help develop a safety plan in the event of an attack. It's always best to be prepared for the worst. That way, when the worst happens, churches will be handled to deal with it. Another good piece of advice for law enforcement in dealing with churches is to help train church employees in first aid. That way, in the event of a terrorist attack, church employees can help render aid to victims on the scene of the attack. Again, this is a very challenging area for law enforcement to work with in helping to respond to terrorism because it is so, you have to worry about the image problems, and you don't want churches to look like they're extreme, and you don't want law enforcement to look like they're arming churches or trying to help religious extremists. The last area of interest are government buildings. Government buildings provide a unique challenge because often they have very high security, and law enforcement have difficulty responding to an active terrorist threat within a government building. Additionally, government buildings are often targeted by terrorists because they can severely disrupt a government's infrastructure and the day-to-day life for ordinary citizens. The first tip for law enforcement when dealing with terrorist attacks or planning for terrorist attacks against government buildings is government buildings should share access codes or give law enforcement key cards to quickly respond to attacks within a government building and render aid when needed. If law enforcement can't access the building where an active threat is, then they are going to be ineffective and unable to effectively respond, address the threat, and care for victims of a terrorist attack. The next thing that they can do is they can teach the run, hide, fight to government employees. That way, in the event of a terrorist attack that takes shape in a mass shooting or other kind of person against person attack, the government employees will be better trained as to what to do and how to protect themselves and others in the event of a terrorist attack. Again, the lesson remains the same, that in an active shooter scenario, an average of 8 people die per minute. In a situation like that where 8 people are dying every single minute of a terrorist attack, it's crucial that law enforcement need to be able to access the affected area and stop the shooter as soon as possible. If they don't have key cards and they don't have access to the secure government facilities that this terrorist attack may be unfolding in, law enforcement will not be able to respond fast enough to stop these deaths from happening. Today we discussed lessons learned by law enforcement and affected police organizations in the event of a terrorist attack. We focused on lessons that were learned by law enforcement, especially the need for an immediate response by law enforcement. We discussed the definition of domestic terrorism, and we discussed schools and how law enforcement needs to, rather than just train tactical teams, train every single officer in what to do in the event of an active shooter or other terrorist threat to the school. We discussed local businesses and teaching them the "if you see something, say something" technique to notify law enforcement and get a proactive approach to a terrorist threat. We discussed having safety talks with law enforcement and local businesses to better equip employees and those at the business or managers to deal with an active terrorist threat. And lastly, we discussed equipping businesses with a panic button that will notify police in the event of a mass shooter or other terrorist threat. We discussed churches and the difficulty of preparing churches for a terrorist attack because they are so often targeted, but you have to be very careful of the image when you are preparing a church for a terrorist attack because you don't want to give the image that you are assisting religious extremists. Again, we need to lock doors and secure the premises to stop people from attacking unarmed churchgoers. Lastly, we discussed government buildings and the difficulty law enforcement has in in responding to to government buildings because of the high security measures taken to secure government buildings. Again, we need to teach government employees to run, hide, or fight in the event of an active person crime such as a stabbing or a shooting. So I hope these lessons today will help the community leaders better equip the members of their community and in businesses and other structures to better deal with terrorist threats. Thank you.